On Being a Pagan, Alain de Benoit. Preface by Stephen Edred Flowers. Translated by John Graham. Edited by Greg Johnson. Chapter 1. Never Dying, Always Reviving. For those who share Nietzsche's belief that the conversion of Europe to Christianity and the more or less complete integration of the European mind into the Christian mentality was one of the most catastrophic events in world history, a catastrophe in the proper sense of the word, just what can the word paganism mean today? This question appears all the more fundamental as it still figures among the crucial problems of the day, as recent polemics may testify. Polemics that furthermore should be relocated within a larger and older disputation. Whatever some may maintain, it is not polytheism that is old hat, but Judeo-Christian monotheism that now finds itself questioned and creaking all over, while paganism is again manifesting its attraction, although it may appear in forms that are often clumsy and sometimes aberrant. In truth, paganism never died. From the attempts to restore solar worship under the Illyrian emperors, notably under Aurelius thanks to the support of Plotinus, and from those undertaken later by the Emperor Julian, it has been a constant inspiration. At the end of the 4th century, a time when Christianity, which had become a state religion, would appear to have triumphed, we can even speak of a pagan renaissance. Two pagan values subsequently continue to survive, both in the collective unconscious and in certain customary folk rituals, incorrectly labeled folklore, in the theology of certain great Christian heretics, and through the expedient of countless literary and artistic revivals. From Ronsard and Du Bellay, literature has never stopped finding a fertile source of inspiration in pre-Christian antiquity, the Roman Empire. In philosophy, finally, in opposition to the partisans of the exclusive primacy of the logos over the mythos, from Descartes and Auguste Comte to Horkheimer and Adorno, are the partisans of the mythos from Vico to Heidegger. At the end of the 15th century, the Renaissance, centered first in Florence before extending over the whole of Europe, was born out of the renewal of contact with the spirit of pagan antiquity. During the golden century of the Medicis, we see the renewed opposition of the Platonists, Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino, and the Aristotelians, Pietro Pomponazzi. Translations of and commentaries on Homer, Demosthenes, Plutarch, the tragedians, the annalists, and the philosophers appeared. The greatest artists, architects, painters, and sculptors drew inspiration from antiquity, not simply for the purposes of copying its works, but as a fertile soil in which new forms could take root. In France, the sister of François I, Marguerite de Navarre, experienced the discovery of Plato's thought as a revelation, according to Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, 1537. Through the reading of the works of Cicero or Plutarch, Erasmus declared, I could feel myself becoming a better man. In this way, the old Greco-Latin gods found a new youth from which all of Europe profited, while in the north, the rediscovery of Germanic antiquity played a similar role in the process of the national renaissance that Germany experienced from the time of Conrad Celtis to that of Nicodemus Frischlin. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was especially the German Romantics who honored and revived the antique spirit. They regarded ancient Greece as the perfect model of a harmonious life. They saw in its exemplary past the image of what might be their own future, and by putting Faust and Prometheus on the same standing, they underlined the profound affinities of the Hellenic spirit with that of their own people. If the divine once existed, said Hölderlin in Substance, then it would return because it is eternal. Novalis and Friedrich Schlegel expressed similar sentiments. For his part, Heinrich von Kleist celebrated the memory of Arminius, Hermann, who in 9 AD created a federation of the Germanic peoples and defied the legions of Varus in the Teutoburg forest. Several decades later, France, with the help of linguistics and archaeology, witnessed a great vogue for pagan literature, something that affected symbolists and Parnassians alike, the Romantics as well as the Neoclassicists. While Victor Hugo, returning to pantheism, defined God as the sum total, fullness for him is infinity to the world, religions et religion, Théophile Gautier praised Hellenism as the soul of our poetry. Le Comte de Lille published his Poems Antiques, 1842, and his Poème Barbares, 1862. Theodore de Bonville, his Caryatides, 1842. José María de Heredia, his Trophies. Juliette Adam, a novel entitled Pagan, 1883. Pierre Louis, Aphrodite and the quite apocryphal Chansons de Bilitis. Anatole France wove crowns for Lucono and Loeta Acilia, and Louis Menard sang the virtues of Hellenic mysticism. Hippolyte Taine lauded Athens as the first country of the beautiful. Albert Samin, Jean Moret, Henri de Regnier, Laforgue, Verlaine, Édouard Chouret-Sully-Prudhomme, Édouard Dujardin, François Coppi, and Madame de Noailles should not be omitted from this list either. Not to mention Catulle Mendes, whose L'Homme Tot Nu has recently been republished. Louis Menard in 1848 regarded polytheism as the foundation of the republican ideal, a respect for pluralism and a critical attitude toward monarchy. This was also the viewpoint of Father J. Gaume, a fanatic adversary of paganism, which he identified with democracy and socialism, and who had no qualms about writing, "The Renaissance was the resurrection, the worship, the fanatic adoration of paganism, with all its literary, artistic, philosophical, moral, and religious idols. The Renaissance gave birth to the Reformation. The Reformation gave birth to Voltairian impiety, and Voltairian impiety gave birth to the French Revolution. The French Revolution is the most dreadful moral catastrophe the world has ever seen." 5. The Church waxed indignant at the prospect of the examples of Themistocles, Cato, Solon, Scipio, and Cincinnatus being offered to the young as sources of inspiration or subjects of study. In the opinion of the Church, neither Horace nor Titus Livy should be taught. This identification of pagan values with those of the emerging left then responded to general opinion. However, there were other authors who sought to pull paganism in the opposite direction. "When I saw the Acropolis," Renan wrote, "I had a divine revelation." 6. In turn, Maurus traveled to Athens, and Barres made the trip to Sparta. The young Maurus, whose profoundly lived paganism Gustave Thiebain, among others, has emphasized 7, declares, "The Parthenon, having existed, no longer needs anybody. It is we who need the Parthenon to develop our own lives." He goes on to vituperate Judeo-Christian obscurantism and the venom of the Magnificat. There would be a constant stream of criticism in France as well as elsewhere, from what convenience calls the right-wing political mentality, from such figures as Sorel and Proudhon, Hugues Rebel and Pierre Lasserre, D'Annunzio, Pareto, Spengler, Moller van den Brack and Ginger, to Drieu La Rochelle, Céline, even Brasillac, who extolled the naive paganism of Joan of Arc 9, in anticipation of Julius Evola, Louis Rougier, Armand Mohier, Louis Pauwels, and Jean Caux. In modern literature, paganism explodes with D.H. Lawrence, see especially his Apocalypse, T.M., Colette Giono, Knut Hamsun, Stefan George, Rilke, and so forth. Montherlant, who made the ancient world a palestra where Hermes rules equally with Minerva, praises the virtue of paganness, and ceaselessly stresses the importance played by the res romana in his work. Opposing the Roman Tiber to the Eastern Orontes, he leaves these instructions. Whenever you experience mental vacillation, cast your mind back to the Greco-Roman mentality as it was before the 2nd century. Among more recent writers, I should cite Marguerite Yourcenar, Jean Marcal, Jan Brikilian, J.R.R. Tolkien, Patrick Granville, and so on. From the time of the ideological blossoming of the New Right and the counteroffensive of Bernard-Henri Lévy and his friends, the monotheism-polytheism quarrel, the monopoly of Parisian literary circles, has become all the rage. Anathematizing any and all Greek parts of our heritage, Lévy has spontaneously rediscovered the reactionary and anti-democratic argument developed by Father Gaume at the same time he was claiming as his watchword the well-known aphorism, "Cursed be the man who teaches his son the science of the Greeks." Louis Pauwels declared the opposite, saying, "There is a secret Europe we must rediscover. I believe in a return to spiritual paganism." The Mexican writer Octavio Paz, who calls himself both a Democrat and polytheist, describes monotheism as one of the greatest catastrophes of humanity. Bernard Houdin denounces monotheism as the very source of totalitarianism. Raymond Rouillet closes one of his last works with an invocation to Zeus. Alain Danielou saw the monotheist illusion as an aberration from the viewpoint of the spiritual experience. Philippe Sollers described Pier Paolo Passoni as both pagan and Judeo-Christian. Folklorists and the historians of mental attitudes constantly collide, when it comes to questions of ordinary folk life, on the question of pagan survivals in the heart of what Carlo Ginzburg calls the peasant religion. This would include social phenomena that are highly contestable in the eyes of many, such as the rage for a kind of esotericism or the ecologist trend, which manifest marginal examples of the resurgence of paganism, the return to nature interpreted as the face of God, the questioning of Christianity from the perspective of spirituality or occultism, and so on. These examples could easily be multiplied. The contemporary trend toward pluralism and honoring one's roots itself contains, finally, at least implicitly, a rejection of Christian equality and reductive universalism. It is also acceptable to share with Odo Marquardt the belief that such a requirement goes necessarily hand in hand with the quest for a polymyth. The crisis of what Gilbert Durand has called the unique worship of a unidimensional meaning of history, aligned on the old thread of a totalitarian logic, the collapse of optimistic certitudes connected to the idea of progress, the stagnation of the disruptionist ideologies of contrarianism, the subsiding of rationalism and positivism, the emergence of ideal types and archetypes as modalities of a necessarily plural collective unconscious, because it always consists of heterogeneous elements, the works that keep multiplying on the imaginal, and the primordial words, the renaissance of myth both as object and way of understanding, the rejection of quantitative mercantile values and universal theoretical orientations. All these features of society are leading to open, heterogeneous, polytheistic, in the proper sense of the word, synthetic, paradoxical determinisms governed by conflictual logics corresponding to the normal state of living systems. In fact, with David Levy-Miller and James Hillman, an entire modern school of psychology preaches the renaissance of polytheism as the sole spirituality that conforms to the state of a polyphonic, polysemous, and multivalent world. In a neighboring domain, a researcher like Gilbert Durand, for whom all society is axiomatically polytheistic and more or less quadrifunctional, argues for an ethics of pluralism, which would also be an ethics of profundity, based on a desire which its own grandeur defines as plural, and the plurality of which can only be guaranteed by the hierarchical principle of difference. While Michel Maffesoli, also rallying to the cause of a polytheism of values evoked by Max Weber, defines paganism as that very thing which, by acknowledging reality's polytheistic nature, teaches one how not to bow down before the force of history or its various avatars and substitutes. The contemporary relevance of paganism is thus not a matter for debate. Neo-paganism, if in fact there is such a thing, is not a cult phenomenon, as imagine not only its adversaries but also sometimes well-intentioned groups and covens who can be described as often clumsy, sometimes unintentionally comical, and perfectly marginal. Nor is this a form of Christianity turned upside down, which would adopt for its own benefit various Christian forms, both rituals and... There is something else that seems especially important to watch out for today, at least according to the idea we have of it. It is less the disappearance of paganism than its re-emergence under primitive or puerile forms, kin to that second religiosity that Spengler rightly described as one of the characteristic traits of cultures in decline. This is also what Julius Evola wrote about as generally corresponding to a phenomenon of escape, alienation, and confused compensation, which is of no serious consequence on reality, something hybrid, decrepit, and sub-intellectual. This requires a certain amount of clarification. Chapter 2. Time and History. In the first place, paganism is not a return to the past. It does not consist of what could be called one past versus another, contrary to what Alain Gérard Slama wrote so casually. It is not a manifestation of a desire to return to some kind of lost paradise. This is rather a Judeo-Christian theme, and even less, contrary to what Catherine Chalier declared so gratuitously, to a pure origin. In a time where one never stops talking about roots and collective memory, The condemnation for being overly attached to the past is self-refuting. Every person is firstborn, an heir. There is no individual or collective identity that does not take into account one's connection to those who create us, the source from which we emerged. Just as yesterday we had the grotesque spectacle of Christian missionaries worshipping their own gree-gree, while denouncing pagan idols, it is somewhat comical today to witness the denunciation of the past, European, by those who ceaselessly boast of the Judeo-Christian continuity and are always presenting for our edification the ever-relevant examples of Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, and other proto-historical Bedouins. On the one hand, we must reach an understanding of just what this word past means. We refuse to give any credence whatsoever to the Judeo-Christian problematic that posits the past as a definitively past point on a line that would necessarily conduct humanity from the Garden of Eden to Messianic times. We do not believe this has any historical meaning. For us, the past is a dimension, a perspective that is totally relevant to the present. There are no such things as past events until they insert themselves as such in the present. The perspective opened by how we represent these events to ourselves transforms our present in exactly the same fashion the meaning we give them by representing them contributes to their own transformation. The past necessarily participates then with that characteristic of human consciousness known as temporality, which is neither the quantity of measurable time, as is commonly assumed today, nor the duration evoked by Bergson, which is the property of non-human nature. Temporality belongs to man alone. Life as worry, Sorge, is extensive of itself, as Heidegger put it. Therefore, it does not fit into any pre-established temporal framework. Man is nothing but a project. His consciousness itself is a project. To exist is to exister, to project, to hurl oneself forward. It is this specific mobility of the extensiveness that Heidegger calls the historizing three, Geschehen, of human existence. A historizing that absolutely marks the very structure of human life, which, as a transcendent and revelatory reality, makes possible the historicity of a world. Man's historicity stems from the fact that he combines past, present, and future in the immediate present, which thus form three dimensions that mutually enrich and transform each other. From this perspective, the typically Judeo-Christian reproach of too great an attachment to the past is entirely devoid of any meaning. This kind of attachment to the past can only exist in a monolinear historical perspective. In fact, in a history where what has passed cannot return again. But this is not the perspective we take. We believe in the eternal return. In 1797, Hölderlin wrote to Hebel, "There is no such thing as annihilation. Therefore the youth of the world must be reborn out of our own decay. In fact, it is not a question of going back to the past, but of connecting with it, and also by that very fact in a spherical conception of history, to connect to the eternal and cause it to surge back, to have consonance in life, and to disentangle itself from the tyranny of the logos, the terrible tyranny of the law, so as to re-establish the school of the mythos and life." In ancient Greece, Jean-Pierre Vernon observes, "The effort to remember the primary purpose of everything is not the construction of the individual past of a man who remembers, the construction of his individual time, but conversely, what allows him to escape time." In the same way, it is a question of referring to the memory of paganism, not in a chronological way so as to return to an earlier time, but in a mythological way, to seek for that which through time surpasses time and still speaks to us today. It is a question of connecting to something that cannot be surpassed rather than to something that has been surpassed. The terms beginning and end, therefore, do not hold the same meaning for us that they do in the Judeo-Christian problematic. In the pagan perspective, the past is always future. Herkunft aber bleibt stets Zukunft, writes Heidegger. What existed in the beginning remains always in the future, remains constantly under the control of what is in the future. In his introduction to metaphysics, Heidegger specifically examines the question of the past. A people, he says, can triumph over the darkening of the world and its decline only if its sights are permanently set upon its destiny. Now a people will be able to gain a destiny from its vocation only when it creates in itself a resonance, a possibility of resonance for this vocation, and grasps its tradition creatively. All this implies that this people, as an historical people, must transpose itself, and with it the history of the West, from the center of their future, happening into the originary realm of the powers of being. In other words, it is necessary to recapture the beginning of our historical spiritual existence in order to transform it into a new beginning, TM. And Heidegger adds, but we do not repeat a beginning by reducing it to something past and now known, which need merely be imitated. No, the beginning must be begun again more originally, with all the strangeness, darkness, insecurity that attend a true beginning. 8. In fact, the beginning is there. It is not behind us as something that has been there a long time, but it stands before us. The beginning has burst into our future. In the distance it pursues its greatness, a grandeur it is imperative we catch up with. So it is not a return so much as a recourse to paganism. Or if one prefers, it is not a return to paganism, but a return of paganism toward what Heidegger in this page of luminous importance called another beginning. There's nothing anyone can do for or against one's genealogy, and a time always comes when each person will have to choose comprehension over resumption, and with it an illumination that does not include denial in order to make the solitary choice of embracing what connects him to or pushes him away from his origins, writes Blandine Barrett Kriegel, who declares herself to be Judeo-Christian. When the undertakings of previous generations come to grief, the natural response is to start over on this side of the bifurcation, to loosen the duration and expand the space. This says exactly what is involved here, to start over on this side of the bifurcation for another beginning. But no doubt such a scheme will appear blasphemous to the eyes of many. In Hebrew, the word beginning also carries the sense of profanation. To begin something, as we will have the opportunity to see, is to compete with God. The truth of this observation is underlined by a passage in Genesis that refers to Enoch, son of Seth, as the first to invoke the name of Yahweh. 4:26, one which is interpreted in Jewish theology as meaning not the beginning of monotheism but the start of paganism. So one began. This verb means to profane. One began giving to men and statues the name of Saint Blessed be He and to call gods idols, was the Rachi commentary on Genesis 4:26. From the time of Simeon Bar Yochai to the present, pagan culture has ceaselessly remained the target of criticisms and accusations. This fact alone, not that it needs to be stated, is sufficient evidence that a certain past remains present in the very eyes of those who denounce it. It is not by chance, writes Gabriel Matzneff, that our fanatic, hateful, and doctrinaire 20th century never missed a single occasion to paint a caricatured and slanderous image of the ancient Romans. It instinctively detests everything that is superior to it. The Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries was precisely that, a rebirth. What it involved, as Renan said, was seeing antiquity face to face. This rebirth was no journey backward or a simple resurgence of the past, but on the contrary, the point of departure for a new spiritual adventure, a new adventure of Die Faustian soul that was now triumphant because it had awakened to itself. Nor is neo-paganism today a regression either. On the contrary, it is the deliberate choice of a more authentic, harmonious, and powerful future, a choice that projects into the future, for new creations, the eternal from which we come. Chapter 3. The Sacred. If one accepts the greatness of something, says Heidegger, then in the beginning of that greatness remains something yet greater. Paganism today therefore clearly requires a certain familiarity with ancient Indo-European religions, their history, their theology, their cosmology, their symbolism, their myths, and the mythemes of which they are composed. A scholarly familiarity, but also a spiritual familiarity, an epistemological familiarity that is also an intuitive familiarity. This is not simply the accumulation of knowledge concerning the beliefs of various European regions from the time predating Christianity, nor is it ignoring what may distinguish them, sometimes profoundly from each other, but primarily of identifying within these beliefs the projection, the transposition of a certain number of values which, as heirs to a culture, belong to us and concern us directly. This consequently leads to the reinterpretation of the history of the last 2 millennia as the story of a fundamental spiritual struggle. By itself, this task is considerable. Not only are the ancient religions of Europe equal to monotheism in their spiritual richness and theological complexity, but it can even be claimed that they often prevail in this domain. Whether they prevail or not over monotheism is not the most important thing, however. What is important is that they speak to us, and for my part I draw more lessons from the teaching of the symbolic opposition of Janus and Vesta, the morality of the Oresteia, or the story of Ymir's dismemberment than the adventures of Joseph and his brothers, or the aborted murder of Isaac. Beyond the myths themselves, it helps in the search for a certain concept of the deity and the sacred, a certain system of interpreting the world, a certain philosophy. Bernard Henry Levy refers to monotheism all the while declaring that he does not believe in God. Our era remains profoundly Judeo-Christian in the way it conceives of history and the essential values it assumes, even if the churches and the synagogues are emptying. Conversely, there's no need to believe in Jupiter or Wotan, something that is no more ridiculous than believing in Yahweh, however, to be a pagan. Contemporary paganism does not consist of erecting altars to Apollo or reviving the worship of Odin. Instead, it implies looking behind religion and, according to a now classic itinerary, seeking for the mental equipment that produced it. The inner world it reflects, and how the world it depicts is apprehended. In short, it consists of viewing the gods as centers of values, H. Richard Niebuhr, and the beliefs they generate as value systems. Gods and beliefs may pass away, but the values remain. This means that paganism, far from being something that can be characterized as a denial of spirituality or a rejection of the sacred, consists on the contrary in the choice and reappropriation of another spirituality, another form of the sacred. Far from being confused with atheism or agnosticism, it poses a fundamentally religious relationship between man and the world, and a spirituality that appears to us as much more intense, much more serious and stronger than what Judeo-Christianity claims for itself. Far from desacralizing the world, it sacralizes it in the literal sense of the word. It regards the world as sacred. And this is precisely, as we shall see, the core of paganism. For example, Jean Marcal writes, "Paganism is not the absence of God, absence of the sacred, absence of ritual. Quite the contrary. It is the solemn affirmation of a transcendence upon recognizing that the sacred no longer resides in Christianity. Europe is never more pagan than when it searches for its roots, which are not Judeo-Christian. The sense of the sacred, spirituality, faith, belief in the existence of God, religion as ideology, religion as system and institution are quite different notions that do not necessarily match up. Neither are they univocal. There are religions that have no God, Taoism, for example. To believe in God does not necessarily imply that it is a personal God. On the other hand, to imagine that all mankind's religious concerns could be removed permanently is pure utopian thinking, in my opinion. Faith is neither repressed nor is it an illusion, and the best that reason can do is recognize the feat that reason alone does not exhaust all of man's inner aspirations. Man is the only animal astonished by his own existence, observes Schopenhauer. The animal lives in its tranquility and is surprised at nothing. This astonishment that occurs especially when confronted by death and the sight of the destruction and disappearance of all the other beings is the source of our metaphysical needs. It is what makes man a metaphysical animal. 5. The need for the sacred is a fundamental human need, in the same way as food or copulation. If there are those who prefer to do without either, then bully for them. Mircea Eliade notes that the experience of the sacred is a structure of consciousness, which one cannot hope to make do without. The individual needs a belief or a religion. We distinguish here religion from morality, to serve him as ritual, as an action that provides unvarying assurance, as an important part of the patterns of habit with which he's constructed. In this regard, the recent appearance of a true disbelief forms part of one of those phenomena of decline that are dismantling in man's structure everything that specifically makes him human. Is the man who has lost the ability or desire to believe still a man? One may at least raise the question. One can have a society without God, writes Regis Debray, but there cannot be a society without religion. He adds, Those nations on the way to disbelief are on the path to abdication. One can also cite Georges Bataille, according to whom religion, whose essence is the search for lost intimacy, boils down to a clearly conscious effort to become entirely self-conscious. This is sufficient to condemn Western liberalism. However, it would certainly be giving too much credit to Judeo-Christianity to reject all those concepts over which it claims to hold a monopoly, solely because it has claimed them. Nor is there any valid reason to reject the idea of God or the notion of the sacred just because of the sickly expression Christianity has given to them, any more than it is necessary to break with aristocratic principles on the pretext that they have been caricatured by the bourgeoisie. It should be noted that in pre-Christian antiquity, the word atheism was practically devoid of meaning. Ancient trials for disbelief or impiety generally dealt with something entirely different. When Ammianus Marcellinus said that there are some people for whom the skies are empty of gods, he explicitly stated that they nevertheless believed in the stars and magic. In Rome, it was Christians who were accused of atheism because they showed no respect for the effigies of the gods or their places of worship. In Greece, rationalist thought simply reoriented mythical theogony and cosmology. This is why Claude Tresmontant, after his gratuitous incorporation of pantheism into atheism, was forced to write that the latter was eminently religious, and that it was by far too religious as it unduly deifies the universe. 9. The fact is that in ancient Europe the sacred was not conceived as opposed to the profane, but rather encompassed the profane and gave it meaning. There was no need for a church to mediate between God and man. The entire city effected this mediation, and its religious institutions formed only a single aspect of it. The opposite concept of the Latin religio should be sought in the Latin verb negligere. To be religious is synonymous with responsibility, not neglect. To be responsible is to be free, to possess the concrete means of exercising free action. At the same time, to be free is also to be connected to others by a common spirituality. When Bernard-Henri Lévy declares that monotheism is not a form of sacrality, a form of spirituality, but on the contrary, the hate of the sacred as such, his remark is only paradoxical in appearance. The sacred is the unconditional respect for something. Monotheism, in the literal sense, places such respect outside the law. For Heidegger, the sacred, das Heilige, is quite distinct from traditional metaphysics and from the very idea of God. We could say, to borrow an antinomy dear to the heart of Emmanuel Levinas, that the sacred vests itself as mystery in this world, that it is based on the intimacy shared by man and the world in contrast to holiness.